My name is Jillian, and I am 33 years old. I came home for Christmas and my mother forgot to give my 7-year-old son a single gift while my sister's children tore into their 12th round of luxury presents. I did not scream or cry. I simply zipped his jacket and walked out the door. The next day, I removed them from the family trust. 30 minutes later, my father called begging for money. By nightfall, my mother left 66 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever cut toxic family members out of your life. Growing up in the affluent Chicago suburbs meant appearances were the only currency that mattered. Our family estate was a stone mansion that looked beautiful from the street but held an emotional emptiness. Christmas morning at my parents' house was always a spectacle of excess. The living room featured 20-foot ceilings and a custom stone fireplace. A towering 12-foot Douglas fir dominated the corner, dripping with expensive glass ornaments and wrapped in shimmering gold ribbon. The air was thick with pine needles, but the festive atmosphere was suffocating. I sat on a velvet sofa watching the chaos unfold. My younger sister Brittany held court in the center of the room. She was the undisputed golden child of the family and played the part flawlessly. At 30 years old, she still acted like a spoiled teenager demanding constant attention. Her 3 children ran rampant across the antique Persian rug, screaming as they ripped through mountains of wrapping paper. They tore into their 12th round of presents with a vicious kind of entitlement. I watched as her oldest boy ripped the paper off a brand new iPad Pro, tossing the box aside without thanks. Her middle daughter squealed, pulling out a designer puffer jacket. Her youngest son was busy trying to ride a motorized electric scooter directly over the expensive upholstery. Brittany sat cross-legged on an ottoman, sipping a mimosa and laughing loudly at her children's destructive behavior. She lived a life of complete leisure in a home entirely funded by our parents. She never worked a day in her life after graduating with a degree she never used. In my parents' eyes, she was the perfect daughter because she married a country club regular and gave them picture-perfect grandchildren they could show off to wealthy friends. I was the exact opposite. I was the family scapegoat, the quiet and responsible older sister who supposedly ruined the family image by becoming a single mother. My parents constantly belittled my life choices. They loved to tell their friends that I worked a boring numbers job as a low-level bookkeeper. They delighted in painting me as a struggling charity case who needed their pity. I never corrected them. I let them believe whatever made them feel superior. My son Leo sat quietly on the edge of the Persian rug. He was 7 years old and the light of my life. He possessed a gentle and observant spirit that was completely out of place in this room full of demanding people. He wore the neat button-down shirt and small bow tie my mother strictly mandated for holiday photos. His small hands rested empty in his lap. He had been sitting there for nearly 45 minutes, watching his cousins unwrap gift after gift. My heart ached as I watched his big brown eyes dart from the towering pile of shredded wrapping paper to the empty space in front of him. He had been so excited for Christmas morning. He had helped me bake cookies for Santa the night before, and he had woken up at the crack of dawn with a bright smile on his face. Now that smile was slowly fading, replaced by a look of quiet confusion. My mother Patricia was lounging in a high-backed leather armchair near the fireplace. She wore a tailored cashmere sweater set and a string of pearls that cost more than a college tuition. She held a crystal wine glass filled with expensive Pinot Grigio, swirling the pale liquid as she watched Brittany's children destroy the living room. She had not spoken a single word to Leo since we arrived. She had not even offered him a glass of water. The discrepancy in treatment was not new. It was a well-established pattern that defined my entire life. When Brittany wanted to study abroad in Paris, my parents wrote a check without blinking. When I needed help with college tuition, they told me responsibility builds character and handed me loan applications. When Brittany got married, they threw a lavish country club wedding for 500 guests. When I had Leo, they complained my hospital room was too far of a drive for them to visit. I watched my son tuck his knees to his chest. He looked so small amidst the glaring display of wealth. I wanted to gather him into my arms and shield him from the toxic dynamic playing out before our eyes. But I remained seated, gripping the edge of the velvet sofa. I was waiting to see if my parents possessed even a shred of basic human decency. The pile of presents under the enormous tree was finally dwindling. Brittany's children were surrounded by a sea of ripped paper and discarded ribbons. They had so many new toys they were already stepping over them. Leo shifted his weight on the rug. He looked over at the tree where only a few stray boxes remained. He looked at me, his eyes pooling with unspoken questions. I gave him a tight smile. He slowly stood up and walked over to where my mother was sitting. He was so polite and so careful not to step on any of his cousin's new toys. He stood beside her leather armchair and waited patiently for her to acknowledge him. Patricia took a slow sip from her crystal wine glass, deliberately ignoring his presence. She stared straight ahead, watching Brittany's youngest son crash the electric scooter into a side table. Leo cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me, Grandma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did Santa leave anything for me in the back?" The room seemed to go completely silent. Even the chaotic screaming of my sister's children faded into the background. I stopped breathing. I stared at my mother, waiting for her to offer some kind of explanation, or perhaps produce a hidden gift from behind her chair. Patricia slowly lowered her wineglass. She finally turned her head to look at my sweet, gentle son. Her expression was completely devoid of warmth or affection. She looked at him as if he were a minor inconvenience that had interrupted her morning. "Oh, I suppose I forgot." She sighed with a casual, devastating shrug that sent a shockwave of pure rage straight through my chest. She did not apologize or look embarrassed. She turned her hard, judging gaze toward me. "You know how tight money is, Jillian," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Brittany's kids expect a certain standard. Just buy him a coloring book on your way home." She took another sip of wine, dismissing us completely. "Now, be a dear and clean up this wrapping paper," she added, waving her perfectly manicured hand toward the massive pile on the floor. Her words hung in the pine-scented air. Before I could respond to that breathtaking cruelty, my father Richard let out a loud scoff from his leather recliner. He did not bother to look up from his tablet where he was reviewing his perpetually failing business accounts. "Do not look like a kicked puppy, Jillian," my father said. His voice carried that familiar irritated tone he reserved exclusively for me. "You are always so dramatic and ungrateful. Your mother just hosted a beautiful holiday morning for this family. Do not ruin the mood because you cannot manage your finances well enough to buy your kid a proper toy." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost paralyzing. He was sitting in a custom-built mansion surrounded by luxury goods he did not actually earn, lecturing me about financial responsibility. Brittany chimed in with a sharp laugh. "Seriously, Jill," she said, adjusting her new diamond bracelet. "Do not make this about you. The kids are having a great time. Just go to the dollar store later." I looked at the three of them. My mother with her cold indifference, my father with his arrogance, and my sister with her endless greed. The old Jillian would have cried tears of frustration and tried to explain why leaving a 7-year-old boy empty-handed was an act of pure malice. I would have spent the day washing their fine china and apologizing. But looking down at my sweet Leo, I realized protecting their feelings was no longer an option. I took a deep breath and let the heavy chain of family obligation drop from my shoulders. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I crouched down on the antique rug until I was eye level with my son. I took his small, trembling hands in mine and offered him the warmest smile I could muster. "We are leaving, buddy," I whispered softly so only he could hear. "Grab your coat." I stood up and took his hand. We turned our backs on the massive Christmas tree and started walking toward the foyer. My movement finally caught my mother's attention. Her wineglass halted. "Where are you going?" Patricia demanded. Her voice grew shrill, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We have 20 guests arriving for Christmas dinner in 4 hours. The caterers are dropping off the main courses, but someone needs to plate the appetizers and wash the dishes." I did not stop walking. I reached the coat closet, pulled out Leo's winter jacket, and helped him thread his small arms through the sleeves. I pulled the zipper up to his chin, making sure he was warm against the bitter Chicago winter outside. "Jillian, get back here right now," my father barked. "You do not get to storm out of this house like a petulant child. If you walk out that door, do not bother coming back." I did not respond. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped into the freezing December air. I let the door click shut behind us, severing the sound of my mother's complaints and my sister's laughter. The sudden quiet of the driveway was a stark contrast to the greed we had just left behind. Frost crunched beneath our boots as we walked down the sweeping cobblestone path. The cold air stung my cheeks, but it felt refreshing, like waking up from a long nightmare. I guided Leo to my sedan, parked at the edge of their massive circular driveway, far away from my sister's brand new luxury vehicles. I opened the rear door and helped him climb into his booster seat. He was exceptionally quiet, his small hands resting politely in his lap. I kissed his cold forehead. "I am so sorry about today, sweetie," I told him, making sure my voice remained steady. "We are going to go home, make hot chocolate, and have our very own wonderfully special Christmas together. Just you and me tonight." He gave me a brave nod, and I gently closed his door, ensuring he was safely buckled inside. I walked around to the driver's side and slid behind the steering wheel. I turned the key in the ignition, letting the heater blast warm air into the chilly cabin. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, staring through the windshield at the massive stone mansion illuminated by extravagant holiday lights. For my entire adult life, my family had operated under a massive delusion. They treated me like a useless burden because they believed a specific narrative they had constructed about my life. In their eyes, I was merely a low-level, struggling bookkeeper who could barely afford to keep the lights on in my modest apartment. They thought my boring numbers job meant I was a financial failure who needed their constant pity and condescension. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a highly successful boutique wealth management firm downtown. I had built a company from the ground up that handled multi-million-dollar portfolios for some of the most influential clients in the city. But that was not the most important secret I kept hidden behind my quiet demeanor. More importantly, they did not know that I was the sole active trustee of the Harrison Family Trust. That trust was the massive estate left behind by my late grandfather. My grandfather was a brilliant and hardworking man who saw right through my parents' superficial facade. Shortly before he passed away, he realized that my father was a terrible businessman and my mother was a reckless spender. He knew that if he left the money directly to them, they would squander the entire family fortune in less than a decade. So he secretly amended his trust. He legally bypassed my greedy parents entirely and placed the absolute power of the estate solely in my hands. He knew I was the only person in the family who truly understood the value of hard work and financial responsibility. For the past 5 years, my parents and my sister firmly believed that a faceless corporate entity at a bank in New York managed their boundless wealth. They believed some random bank manager was the one approving the funds that paid the mortgage on that sprawling stone mansion. They thought an automated system funded Brittany's extravagant lifestyle and covered the cost of those 12 ridiculous Christmas gifts while my son got nothing. They thought they were untouchable. They thought their money was an infinite resource that shielded them from any consequences. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark interior of my car. I took one last look at the house where I had endured decades of emotional abuse, constant belittlement, and absolute disrespect. They thought leaving my son empty-handed would put me in my place. They were incredibly wrong. I slowly unlocked my personal phone and securely opened my highly secure banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying the massive balance of the Harrison Family Trust and the various sub-accounts linked to my parents and my sister. I navigated to the administrative control panel. The power to dismantle their entire perfect world rested right beneath my fingertips. I did not feel sad. I did not feel conflicted. I simply felt ready. I took a very slow, deep breath, carefully hovered my thumb over the digital screen, and prepared to strike. I did not press the button right then. Doing this from the front seat of my car with my son in the back was not the right way to handle a financial execution. I locked my phone and drove us back to our apartment. We spent the rest of Christmas evening exactly as I promised him. We drank hot chocolate, watched animated holiday movies, and built a massive fort out of blankets in the living room. I made sure Leo felt completely loved and utterly safe. I did not send a single angry text message to my parents. I simply put my phone on silent and let them enjoy their final night of blissful ignorance. The morning after Christmas, the city of Chicago was quiet and covered in a fresh layer of white snow. I arrived at my pristine high-rise office building downtown long before any of my employees. I unlocked the heavy glass doors of my firm and walked straight to my corner office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows for a long moment, watching the icy gray waters of Lake Michigan churn under the pale winter sun. The calm surface of the lake mirrored my own internal state. I was not operating out of sudden, uncontrollable rage. I was operating with absolute cold precision. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk and powered on my dual monitors. I logged into the primary administrative portal for the Harrison Family Trust. The trust agreement had always been simple. My grandfather had placed every major distribution under my authorization because he knew unrestricted access would eventually destroy everything he had built. For 5 years, I had exercised that authority, quietly approving legitimate expenses and preventing the worst of my parents' reckless decisions from reaching the estate itself. They mistook my restraint for the generosity of an invisible bank. What happened to Leo made me understand that restraint had slowly turned into permission. Continuing to finance their behavior would no longer protect my grandfather's legacy. It would only reward the people abusing it. I clicked into the master control panel. The screen displayed the staggering balance of the main trust, followed by the individual sub-accounts allocated to Patricia, Richard, and Brittany. I could see the live transactions pending on their supplementary platinum credit cards. My mother had apparently started early, attempting to charge a massive purchase at a luxury boutique. It was time to put an end to the madness. I navigated to the restriction settings and selected the discretionary pause clause. My grandfather had explicitly written this clause into the trust for exactly this type of situation. It gave the trustee the unilateral authority to halt all distributions if the beneficiaries were acting against the long-term health of the estate. A text box appeared on my screen prompting me to enter the legal justification for the sudden freeze. I typed my reasoning with steady fingers, citing fiscal irresponsibility and flagrant misuse of resources. I hit enter, and the system immediately locked the primary funding source. But I was not finished. A simple freeze on the main account was not enough to dismantle the lifestyle they had so cruelly paraded in front of my son. I needed to cut the individual strings. I opened the automated disbursement schedule. Every first of the month, a massive stipend was transferred into my parents' joint checking account to cover their extravagant mortgage, their country club fees, and their household staff. I clicked the toggle switch from active to suspended. Next, I found Brittany's monthly allowance. She received thousands of dollars a month just to exist as the golden child, money she spent on designer clothes and pointless hobbies while claiming she was too stressed to get a real job. I canceled her recurring transfer permanently. Then I moved to the credit lines. The family used supplementary platinum credit cards directly tied to the trust's corporate account. They treated these cards like magic plastic that never ran out of funds. I pulled up the card management interface. I highlighted Patricia's card, Richard's card, Brittany's card, and even the card they had generously provided to Brittany's husband, Kevin. With one click, I reduced their spending limits to 0. The system confirmed that all future transactions would be immediately declined at the point of sale. I could only imagine the humiliation my mother would face the next time she tried to buy her way into high society with a useless piece of plastic. The final step was their luxury vehicle leases. My father drove a brand new Mercedes, My mother had a custom Range Rover, and Brittany drove a top-of-the-line imported SUV. The monthly lease payments were automatically drafted from the trust. I located the autopay agreements for all three vehicles and revoked the banking authorization. The leasing companies would not receive their scheduled payments next week. If they did not come up with the cash themselves, those beautiful cars would be repossessed. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and looked at my monitors. Red warning icons now covered the dashboard next to every family member's name. The financial pipeline that had sustained their arrogant delusions of grandeur was completely severed. The stone mansion was now just a massive liability they could not afford. The designer clothes, the country club dinners, the endless piles of luxury Christmas gifts, all of it was over. I had systematically dismantled their entire financial foundation in less than 15 minutes. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow sip. A small part of me, the part that was still the little girl hoping for her mother's approval, felt a brief twinge of sorrow. I had always hoped they would wake up one day and realize that family was more important than money. But yesterday had shattered that illusion permanently. When my mother looked at my innocent son and callously told me to buy him a coloring book while her other grandchildren drowned in luxury, she crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had forced my hand. They treated me like a peasant in their royal court, entirely unaware that I held the actual keys to the kingdom. My grandfather had given me this immense power because he knew I would only use it when necessary. He trusted me to protect the incredible legacy he had built with his own two hands. I closed the banking portal and locked my computer screen. The war had officially begun, but I held all the heavy ammunition. I knew it was only a matter of time before they realized the money was gone. I knew the panic would set in quickly, followed by anger, and then desperate confusion. I placed my cell phone face up on the polished wood of my desk. I sat there in the quiet elegance of my office, perfectly calm, waiting silently for the first domino to fall. Once the restrictions were confirmed, there was nothing left for me to reconsider. Every credit card transfer request, lease payment, and monthly distribution now had to pass through controls my family could not override. The system would not argue with them or surrender to their threats. It would simply decline every attempt to spend money they had never earned. I returned to my acquisition reports and placed my phone face up beside my keyboard. The next move belonged to them. All I had to do was wait for their first demand to reveal how completely they had confused financial dependence with personal power. The heavy mahogany clock on my office wall ticked in steady rhythm. I spent the next hour reviewing acquisition reports for my firm and answering emails from my actual clients, compartmentalizing my family drama with the same discipline I applied to corporate mergers. Down on the street below the city of Chicago was waking up. Commuters were shuffling through the snow, coffee shops were filling with morning rushes, and the major financial institutions were officially opening their doors for post-holiday business. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The automated banking systems across the country were coming online, processing the massive backlog of weekend transactions and executing the restriction codes I had just finalized. I kept my personal cell phone resting face up on the polished wood of my desk. I did not have to wait very long. At exactly 9:30, my phone screen illuminated, vibrating against the hard surface. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow breath to ensure my voice carried no trace of emotion. I swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Good morning, Dad." I answered, my tone perfectly neutral and professional. "Jillian," my father barked into the receiver. There was no polite greeting. There was no inquiry about how Leo was feeling after being completely ignored on Christmas morning. He sounded breathless and deeply agitated, speaking with a rapid urgency that immediately told me everything I needed to know. The initial shockwave had made impact. "I need you to wire $5,000 to my primary business account right now," he demanded. "Do not ask questions, just do it. I will pay you back by the end of the week." I leaned forward in my leather chair, resting my elbows on the desk. "You need me to wire you $5,000, I repeated calmly. "Yes," He snapped his voice, echoing loudly through the receiver. My logistics company account is suddenly overdrawn, and the bank is being ridiculously difficult this morning. Some automated error triggered a freeze on my credit lines, and I have vendors threatening to hold my shipping containers at the port if I do not clear the balance immediately. I spent an hour yelling at a customer service representative, but they keep telling me the primary account holder needs to authorize the release. It is a complete bureaucratic nightmare. Just transfer the cash from your savings so I can get these vendors off my back. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. Less than 24 hours ago, he had sat in his custom-built mansion, surrounded by unearned luxury, and called me a dramatic and ungrateful burden. He had watched my mother tell me to buy my son a coloring book because money was supposedly tight, while Brittany's children unwrapped thousands of dollars in electronics. Now he was ordering me to drain my own savings to bail out his failing business, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the primary account holder he was desperately trying to reach. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Dad," I said, keeping my voice cold and detached. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" he demanded. His irritation was instantly replaced by genuine anger. "It is $5,000, Jillian. You have a steady job. You do not have a mortgage. You should have that kind of liquid cash sitting around." I tapped a sleek silver pen against my legal pad. "I simply do not have the disposable income to spare right now," I informed him, playing directly into the pathetic narrative they had constructed for me. "As Mom pointed out yesterday, money is tight. I have Leo's expenses to consider, and I cannot afford to empty my accounts for a business loan." I heard him slam his hand against a hard surface on his end of the line. "This is exactly why you will never be successful, Jillian," he sneered. "You lack any sense of family loyalty or big-picture thinking. I am dealing with a massive corporate crisis here, and you are worrying about pennies. If you were half as supportive as your sister, maybe you would actually get somewhere in life. Forget it. I will have Brittany put it on her platinum card until the bank fixes this stupid error." He ended the call abruptly, leaving a harsh dial tone ringing in my ear. I lowered the phone and allowed a small, sharp smile to form on my lips. He was going to ask Brittany to use her platinum card. The same platinum card I had just reduced to a $0 spending limit less than an hour ago. He was rushing headfirst into a brick wall, entirely confident that his wealth would magically catch him. I spent the rest of the workday operating my wealth management firm. I led 2 strategy meetings, finalized a lucrative commercial real estate acquisition, and enjoyed a quiet lunch with my executive team. I did not check the Harrison Family Trust dashboard again. I did not need to. I knew the automated security protocols were working flawlessly. Every time they tried to swipe a card, authorize a transfer, or withdraw cash, they were hitting a digital concrete barrier. The frustration in the mansion must have been reaching a boiling point. When the workday concluded, I drove back to my apartment. Leo and I made homemade pizzas from scratch and spent the evening reading books on the living room rug. I kept my personal phone tucked away inside my purse, completely ignoring the outside world. I wanted my son to have a peaceful, joyful evening, entirely separated from the financial chaos currently dismantling my parents' false reality. After I tucked Leo into bed and softly closed his bedroom door, I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold, sparkling water. The digital clock on my microwave glowed brightly in the dim light. It was exactly 9 o'clock at night. The day was over and the storm had officially arrived. I walked over to my purse and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen was dark, but the moment I tapped it, a massive wave of notifications flooded the display. The sheer volume of alerts caused the device to freeze for a brief second before catching up. I looked at the lock screen and let out a soft laugh. There were exactly 66 missed calls from my mother. Below the missed calls were dozens of frantic text messages. I scrolled through the chaotic stream of notifications, piecing together the timeline of her absolute panic. The financial panic had deeply set in, yet they remained entirely oblivious that I was the one holding the leash. They were utterly trapped. The screen of my cell phone went dark for a fraction of a second before illuminating once more. The device vibrated violently against my kitchen counter, signaling the arrival of the 67th phone call. I stood in the quiet warmth of my apartment, watching my mother's name flash across the digital display. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold liquid ground me in the present moment. I had given them enough time to marinate in their absolute terror. It was time to pull the curtain back just an inch further. I set my glass down on the granite countertop and picked up the phone. I swiped my thumb across the glowing green button and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited for the inevitable explosion. Jillian, my mother, shrieked into the phone. Her voice was completely stripped of its usual refined country club elegance. It was a high-pitched, breathless wail of pure hysteria. "Where on earth have you been? I have been calling you for hours." I held the phone slightly away from my ear as her shrill tone echoed in my quiet kitchen. "Good evening, Mom," I said smoothly. My voice was calm and even, offering a stark contrast to her frantic energy. I was putting Leo to bed and reading him a story. "What seems to be the problem?" "The problem is that my entire life is falling apart," she screamed. She was speaking so quickly her words were stumbling over one another. "We are dealing with an absolute catastrophe over here. That stupid, incompetent bank in New York has completely frozen all of our assets without a single word of warning. I was standing at the register at the spa, trying to buy your sister her holiday package, and my platinum card was declined." "Declined, Jillian. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" The cashier looked at me like I was some kind of street beggar trying to steal from them. I kept my facial expression completely neutral, though a deep sense of satisfaction settled into my chest. "That sounds incredibly stressful, Mom," I replied in a flat monotone. "Have you tried calling the bank customer service line?" "Of course we tried calling them," she snapped. Her breathing was ragged and I could hear the faint sound of my father yelling at someone in the background. "Your father has been screaming at their representatives for hours, but they are completely useless. They keep repeating the same robotic garbage about a discretionary pause and flagrant misuse of resources. They will not tell us anything else. They just sent over a massive pile of complicated legal paperwork via email, and they are demanding we review it before they will even escalate our complaint to a supervisor." She paused to catch her breath, and the familiar edge of condescension crept back into her voice, momentarily overriding her panic. "Which is exactly why I need you to drive over here immediately," she commanded. "You need to read through all this legal jargon and figure out what is going on. Staring at boring documents is the only thing you are actually good for anyway. Your sister is too distressed to look at a computer screen, and your father is busy dealing with his own bank issues. Get in your car and come over here right now." Even in a moment of sheer financial terror, she could not resist slipping the knife in. She still believed I was the obedient, desperate scapegoat who would come running the moment she snapped her fingers, grateful for any crumb of attention. She honestly thought she was insulting me by demanding my help with boring financial paperwork. She had no idea that those boring documents were the exact weapons I used to build my corporate empire. I did not argue with her. I did not defend my intelligence or demand an apology for her cruel remarks. That would have ruined the beautiful trap I was meticulously setting. "I will be right there, Mom," I said simply. "Let me grab my coat." I ended the call before she could say another word. The silence returned to my kitchen, but my blood was thumping with a steady, rhythmic anticipation. I walked down the short hallway and peeked into Leo's bedroom. He was sound asleep, his chest rising and falling beneath his favorite superhero blanket. My trusted neighbor, an older retired woman named Martha, who adored Leo like her own grandson, had already agreed to come sit in the living room while I handled a sudden work emergency. Martha arrived a few minutes later carrying a paperback book and a warm smile. "Take all the time you need, Jillian," she whispered as she settled onto my sofa. "He is safe with me." I thanked her quietly and walked to my hall closet. I pulled out my tailored wool trench coat and slipped it on over my sleek turtleneck sweater and dark slacks. I did not look like a struggling bookkeeper arriving to grovel. I looked like a chief executive officer preparing to dismantle a hostile corporation. I reached down and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. Inside, nestled beneath my laptop, were physical copies of the Harrison Family Trust documents, clearly showing my absolute authority as the sole trustee. I was not bringing them to help my parents. I was bringing them to prepare for the final blow. I walked out to the parking garage and climbed into my sedan. The drive to my parents' sprawling estate took exactly 40 minutes. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the suburban streets slick and illuminated by the bright orange glow of the street lamps. I drove in complete silence, refusing to turn on the radio. My mind was sharp and intensely focused. I replayed the sound of my mother's panicked voice, analyzing the sheer entitlement embedded in her distress. They truly believed the money was a fundamental right, an endless stream of wealth they deserved simply for existing. As I navigated the winding tree-lined roads of their affluent neighborhood, the massive houses grew larger and more extravagant. These were homes built on generational wealth and corporate success. My parents had pretended they belonged in this elite tier, using my grandfather's hard-earned money to buy their way into a social circle that would discard them the second their bank accounts read zero. And that moment had officially arrived. I turned my steering wheel and pulled into their long, sweeping cobblestone driveway. The estate looked exactly as it had the night before, completely bathed in the glow of hundreds of expensive holiday lights. But the atmosphere was entirely different. Even from the driveway, I could sense the chaotic energy radiating from the stone walls. All the lights on the first floor were blazing. My father's luxury Mercedes and Brittany's imported SUV were parked haphazardly near the garage, completely out of alignment with their usual pristine arrangement. I put my car in park and turned off the engine. I sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. This was the house where I had been systematically ignored, heavily criticized, and emotionally neglected for decades. This was the house where they had laughed at my dreams, ridiculed my career choices, and treated my beautiful son like an unwanted burden just 24 hours ago. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the sturdy handle of my leather briefcase. I stepped out of the car, my boots hitting the freezing pavement with a solid thud. The winter wind whipped my hair across my face as I walked purposefully toward the grand double doors of the mansion. I did not feel small anymore. I did not feel like the disappointment of the family. I felt like the architect of their impending reality. I climbed the stone steps, raised my hand, and turned the heavy brass knob, pushing the door open to step directly into the chaos. The massive crystal chandelier in the grand foyer cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the scene unfolding before me. The immaculate entryway was entirely ruined. The air was thick with the sharp scent of spilled expensive perfume and the unmistakable tension of a family unraveling in real time. My sister Brittany was pacing back and forth across the checkered marble floor, her face flushed a blotchy, unattractive red. Her hands were waving wildly in the air as she shouted at her husband Kevin, who was slumped on the bottom step of the sweeping mahogany staircase, with his head buried in his hands. He looked completely defeated, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant country club demeanor. My mother stood near the entrance to the formal dining room, clutching a stack of crumpled papers to her chest like a shield. I stepped further into the foyer, closing the heavy wooden door behind me with a soft click. The sound drew my sister's attention. Brittany stopped her frantic pacing and glared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked like a spoiled child who had just been told the entire toy store was closed indefinitely. Kevin did not even lift his head. He just let out a long, miserable groan that echoed up the curved staircase. "Do you have any idea what is happening right now?" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her own hysteria. "My car, Jillian! They are threatening to take my car!" I kept my face perfectly composed, though a deep sense of poetic justice settled comfortably in my chest. "What happened to your car, Brittany?" I asked, my tone projecting a mild, polite confusion. "It is Kevin's luxury SUV," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at her husband. "We tried to take the kids out for a post-Christmas dinner at the steakhouse downtown, and his lease payment bounced. The payment was supposed to automatically draft from the family account yesterday, but the dealership just left a completely unhinged voicemail on his cell phone." The dealership manager was completely furious. Kevin had ignored their previous warnings. The situation was escalating very quickly. They demanded a wire transfer immediately. They said if we do not wire them the overdue balance plus a massive penalty fee, by tomorrow morning they are sending a tow truck to repossess the vehicle right out of our driveway. Do you understand how embarrassing that would be? Our neighbors would see a tow truck hauling away a $100,000 vehicle. We would be a complete laughingstock. She grabbed a throw pillow from the entryway bench and threw it across the room in a fit of absolute rage. The sheer vanity of her panic was astounding. She was not worried about her finances or the stability of her family. She was exclusively terrified that the neighbors might realize she was no longer drowning in unearned wealth. Before I could offer a response to Brittany's tantrum, my mother marched forward from the dining room. Patricia had abandoned her usual composed elegance entirely. Her hair was slightly out of place and her eyes carried a wild, desperate energy. She aggressively pointed a finger directly at my face, closing the distance between us until she was standing just inches away. "This is all your fault," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of anger and fear. I stared at her, genuinely fascinated by the Olympic-level mental gymnastics she was performing. "How exactly is a banking error my fault, Mom?" I asked smoothly. Patricia let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Do not play stupid with me, Jillian. You know exactly what you did. You stormed out of this house yesterday like a petulant, dramatic child. You brought an incredibly dark, negative energy into this home on Christmas Day, and you ruined the holiday spirit for everyone. You threw off the entire balance of this family, and now the universe is punishing us for your miserable attitude. It is bad karma. You brought bad karma down on our finances because you could not just smile and be grateful for what you have. It was the ultimate manifestation of her narcissism. She constantly blamed me for everything. In her mind, she could never be at fault for her own reckless spending or cruel behavior. If something went wrong in her perfectly curated life, it had to be the fault of the designated family scapegoat. I did not defend myself against her ridiculous claims. I simply looked at her with a calm, unblinking gaze. "Stop staring at me like that, and make yourself useful," Patricia commanded, shoving the thick stack of crumpled papers directly into my chest. I reached up and caught the documents before they could scatter across the marble floor. The bank sent over all this incredibly dense legal paperwork and these confusing financial notices. Your father and I do not have the time or the patience to sit here and translate bureaucratic nonsense. You work with numbers all day. You deal with this low-level administrative garbage for a living. I want you to read through every single page of these documents. Figure out exactly what kind of stupid technicality is holding up our money. And then I want you to get on the phone with their customer service department." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, glaring at me with absolute expectation. "You are going to sit on hold for as long as it takes, and you are going to beg whoever is in charge to release our funds immediately. Tell them we are high-priority clients. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to fix this mess. Do not fail us today." I looked down at the messy stack of papers in my hands. I recognized the official letterhead of the Harrison Family Trust immediately. These were the exact notification letters my own firm had automatically generated and emailed to them when I initiated the discretionary pause just 12 hours ago. It was almost poetic that my mother was demanding I read the very documents I had personally authorized. "I will see what I can find," I said quietly. I adjusted my wool coat, turned away from Patricia and Brittany, and walked into the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was usually set with fine china and expensive floral arrangements, but tonight it was covered in scattered mail-printed emails and half-empty coffee cups. It looked like the war room of a failing corporation. I set my heavy leather briefcase down on one of the plush dining chairs and took a seat at the head of the table. I laid the stack of financial notices flat on the smooth wood and began sorting them into organized piles. I smoothed out the wrinkles my mother had carelessly made in the pages. I took my time, ignoring the sounds of Brittany continuing to complain to Kevin in the foyer. I let my eyes scan the columns of frozen assets, declined transactions, and suspended lease agreements. They had thrown their entire financial reality in front of me, completely unaware that I was the one who had constructed the cage they were currently trapped inside. The power dynamics had entirely shifted, and they were completely blind to it. I held their future in my hands. I sifted through the papers, fully prepared to play the role of the obedient, helpful daughter for just a little while longer. The dining room was quiet, except for the rustling of thick parchment paper under my fingertips. I methodically organized the stack into 3 distinct categories. The first pile consisted of standard decline notices from various high-end retailers and luxury car dealerships. The second pile held the official restriction letters my automated system had generated. But it was the third pile that caught my undivided attention. These were documents my parents had haphazardly mixed in from my father's home office, likely gathered in a blind panic when the bank first notified them of the sweeping freeze. I slid a thick packet of stapled pages toward the center of the mahogany table. The bold heading at the top indicated it was a commercial lending agreement from a predatory private equity firm known for issuing high-risk corporate bailout loans. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text, instinctively analyzing the financial terms. My father owned a mid-sized logistics and freight company that he had inherited from a distant uncle. He always bragged about his keen business acumen at country club dinners, but the numbers staring back at me painted a drastically different reality. His company was not just struggling, it was completely bankrupt. The loan application detailed millions of dollars in outstanding debts, unpaid vendor invoices, and severely delinquent employee payroll accounts. He was drowning in a financial sinkhole of his own creation. I turned to the third page of the application and my heart skipped a single deliberate beat. I leaned closer to the document, tracing my index finger along the collateral declaration section. To secure this massive high-interest bailout loan, Richard needed to prove he had the assets to back it up. He did not use the stone mansion because it was already leveraged to the hilt. Instead, he had listed the Harrison Family Trust as the primary guarantor. A cold wave of realization washed over me. My father had not just submitted a desperate loan application. He had actively committed federal wire fraud. He had forged official authorization documents attempting to pledge the protected assets of my grandfather's trust as unauthorized collateral for his failing commercial enterprise. He had somehow mocked up digital signatures and fabricated a letter of consent, falsely claiming he was the managing director of the estate. It was a staggering display of criminal arrogance. If this private equity firm actually processed this paperwork and discovered the fraudulent backing, my father would face severe federal charges. He would go to federal prison. I sat back in the dining chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his crime. He was not just a terrible businessman who blew his allowance on luxury cars. He was a desperate criminal trying to illegally leverage wealth that belonged to the entire family bloodline just to save his bruised ego. He had risked everything out of pure selfishness. I looked at the forged signature on the bottom line. It was sloppy, arrogant, and entirely illegal. I took a slow breath, preparing to point out this massive discrepancy. I wanted to look my father in the eyes and ask him how he planned to explain federal bank fraud to his elite social circle. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, a manicured hand slammed down onto the mahogany table. Brittany stormed into the dining room, her face still red from her screaming match with Kevin in the foyer. She reached across the polished wood and aggressively snatched the entire stack of documents right out of my hands. The papers crumpled slightly under her tight grip. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Brittany snapped. Her voice was dripping with venom and absolute condescension. She held the paperwork against her chest like I was trying to steal it from her. "I am reviewing the financial notices Mom asked me to look at," I said, keeping my tone perfectly mild. "I found something very concerning in Dad's commercial loan applications that we need to discuss right now. It involves the trust." Brittany let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed terribly against the vaulted ceiling. "You found something concerning," she repeated, rolling her eyes. "Please, Jillian. You are a low-level clerk who balances spreadsheets for middle-class nobodies. You do not understand the first thing about complex wealth management or high-tier corporate financing. You probably just saw a big number and panicked because you have never seen a bank account with more than 3 digits in it. Do not pretend you know how to navigate the financial strategies of wealthy people." I stared at her, watching the sheer arrogance radiate from her posture. She was standing there in a designer silk blouse, completely oblivious to the fact that she was defending a federal crime that would destroy her entire lifestyle. She genuinely believed her own delusions of grandeur. "Mom only asked you to come over here so you could sit on hold with the bank customer service robots." Brittany continued, stepping closer to the table to tower over me. But you are clearly too incompetent to even do that correctly. We do not need your useless opinions on Dad's business. We are taking matters into our own hands. Kevin just got off the phone with a real professional. We are hiring a top-tier corporate lawyer to force the trust to release our money immediately. I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my calm demeanor. You are hiring a lawyer to sue the bank. We are hiring the best lawyer in Chicago, Brittany declared proudly. She tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder, looking incredibly smug. We are retaining Vincent Gallagher from Gallagher and Associates. He destroys massive corporations in court every single day. He is going to file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning, and he is going to drag whatever faceless bank manager authorized this freeze straight through the mud. Gallagher promised Kevin he will have our platinum cards reactivated by the end of the week. I simply nodded, keeping my facial expression completely blank. Internally, a bright flare of amusement illuminated my chest. I knew the name Vincent Gallagher very well. His law firm was located just 3 blocks away from my own corporate headquarters downtown. He was an arrogant, flashy, incredibly loud local attorney who relied heavily on aggressive media tactics rather than solid legal arguments. My wealth management company routinely faced off against Gallagher and Associates in complex corporate litigation. My internal legal team destroyed Vincent Gallagher in court on a regular basis. He was a minor nuisance, a legal mosquito that we swatted away without breaking a sweat. If Vincent Gallagher was the man they were bringing to this gunfight, it was going to be an absolute slaughter. And just so we are perfectly clear, Jillian, Brittany added, leaning her hands on the table and glaring down at me. Once Gallagher sorts out this ridiculous bank error, and once our money is flowing again, we are officially cutting you out of this family forever. You have been completely useless to us during this entire financial crisis. You walked out on us during Christmas, you brought negative energy into our home, and now you are making up terrible lies about Dad's business just to make yourself feel important. We do not need you dragging us down with your pathetic behavior anymore. You should just go back to your sad little apartment and stay out of our way while the smart adults handle real corporate problems. Before I could rise from the dining table, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. My father entered the room with his phone pressed against his ear, still arguing with another bank representative. He ended the call, shoved the device into his pocket, and glared at the documents Brittany was holding. "What did she find?" he demanded. "Nothing important," Brittany replied quickly. "She is pretending she understands your loan." I looked directly at him. "Did you authorize a letter naming yourself managing director of the Harrison Family Trust?" For the first time that evening, his expression shifted. It was only a fraction of a second, but I saw fear move behind his eyes. "You have no idea how corporate financing works," he said. "Temporary collateral declarations are standard business tools, not when the collateral belongs to a trust you do not control." Richard stepped closer and ripped the packet from Brittany's hands. "That money belongs to this family. I have every right to use it to protect a family business." The statement was not a denial. It was an admission wrapped in entitlement. Patricia appeared in the doorway and folded her arms. "This is exactly why we should never have invited you back. You arrive, create chaos, and then accuse your father of crimes because you want attention." I closed my briefcase calmly. While sorting the documents, I had already scanned every relevant page into the encrypted case management application on my phone. The forged signature, the fabricated consent letter, the collateral declaration, and the loan disclosures were preserved in a secure corporate server my family could never access. Richard held the papers against his chest. "Gallagher will fix the accounts tomorrow. After that, I do not want you interfering in this family's finances again. You should show him every page," I replied, "especially the ones with the forged authorization." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Brittany pointed toward the foyer. "You heard Dad. Leave." There was no reason to warn them again. They had seen the evidence and chosen arrogance over caution. Whatever happened next would not be the result of ignorance. It would be the result of a deliberate decision. I did exactly what my sister suggested. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase, turned my back on her smug expression, and walked straight out of the formal dining room without uttering a single word in my defense. The drive back to my apartment was remarkably peaceful. I did not feel the usual heavy weight of anxiety that typically followed a confrontation with my family. Instead, I felt a profound sense of crystal clear clarity. They had shown me their absolute worst, and they had done it with a terrifying level of arrogance. My father had committed federal wire fraud, and my sister had violently defended him while mocking the person who held their financial survival in her hands. They were so deeply entrenched in their delusions of grandeur that they could not even recognize the danger they were in. The next morning, I woke up early and made a warm breakfast for Leo. I dropped him off at his winter break day camp, giving him a tight hug before heading into my downtown office. I settled into my leather chair and opened my laptop, ready to tackle the real corporate problems Brittany had haughtily dismissed. But before I could review my morning emails, my personal cell phone illuminated with a rapid succession of notifications. The alerts were not coming from my banking portal. They were coming from social media. I unlocked my phone and tapped the application icon. The screen loaded, and I was greeted by a massive wall of digital outrage. Desperate for attention and eager to control the narrative before anyone else could speak, Brittany had taken to her highly curated platforms. She posted a lengthy, heavily edited video simultaneously to Facebook and Instagram. The thumbnail image alone was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It showed Brittany sitting on the edge of her pristine white sofa, wearing a modest, muted sweater and no makeup. She had clearly gone out of her way to look vulnerable and deeply wounded. I pressed play, and the video began. Brittany looked directly into the camera lens with wide, watery eyes. She took a shuddering breath, perfectly timing a single tear to roll down her cheek. "Hey, everyone," she began, her voice quivering with manufactured heartbreak. "I do not normally post personal family matters on here, but I just feel so incredibly lost and betrayed right now, and I need a safe space to vent." I leaned back in my chair watching my sister deliver the performance of a lifetime. She wove a spectacularly fabricated tale about how her jealous, toxic older sister had completely ruined our beautiful family Christmas. She claimed I had stormed into our parents' home with a massive chip on my shoulder, deliberately trying to make everyone miserable because I was unhappy with my own life choices. She dramatically recounted how I abruptly dragged my poor son out into the freezing cold before dessert was even served, just to punish our elderly parents for no reason at all. But that was just the warm-up. Brittany took another jagged breath, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. As if ruining the holidays was not enough, she told her thousands of followers. "Our parents are currently dealing with a very stressful temporary bank error. Some automated glitch has frozen their accounts right before the new year. We asked my sister to help us navigate the customer service lines because she works in bookkeeping, but she outright refused. She looked us in the eyes and said she would rather watch our parents lose their home than lift a single finger to help them. She is doing this out of pure spite." The sheer audacity of her lies was impressive. She had expertly framed my parents as helpless, terrified seniors who were being bullied by an evil banking system. She painted herself as the devoted, loving daughter desperately trying to hold the family together. And she cast me as the ultimate villain, a bitter, resentful monster who kicked her own flesh and blood while they were down. She never mentioned that the temporary bank error was actually a targeted freeze due to massive financial irresponsibility. She certainly did not mention our father was actively committing federal loan fraud. She just wanted the sympathy of the internet to ensure my reputation was completely destroyed among our extended social circle. I scrolled down to read the comment section, and the digital vitriol was staggering. Extended relatives, country club acquaintances, and family friends had absolutely flooded the post with hundreds of messages. They were eager to perform their loyalty to the golden child, and they did not hold back their cruelty toward me. My Aunt Susan, who always fawned over Brittany's beauty, was one of the top comments. "I am so sorry you have to deal with her, Brittany. Your sister has always been an ugly, bitter girl who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. She is just insanely jealous of your perfect life and your beautiful husband. Keep your head up." My cousin Danielle replied right beneath her. "It is honestly pathetic. She dropped out of the traditional path years ago and has been holding a grudge ever since. Imagine being so miserable in your sad little life that you try to punish your own parents over a banking glitch. She is a complete failure of a daughter." The comments went on, a seemingly endless scroll of judgment and condemnation. They branded me a failure, a dropout, a toxic burden, and an ungrateful child. They praised Brittany for her strength and offered endless prayers for my parents to quickly resolve their minor financial inconvenience. They fed right into the delusion, aggressively reinforcing the false narrative my family had spent decades building. They all firmly believed I was sitting in my apartment seething with jealousy over Brittany's designer clothes and my parents' stone mansion. A younger, more insecure version of myself would have been absolutely devastated by this public character assassination. I would have felt the burning urge to jump into the comment section and aggressively defend myself. I would have wanted to type out long, desperate paragraphs explaining the truth about Christmas morning, about how my mother had callously ignored my son, about how I was just trying to protect my child from their toxicity. I would have wanted to scream into the digital void that I was not a failure. But sitting there in my high-rise office looking out over the sprawling city skyline, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating calm. I did not type a single word in response. I completely ignored the social media bait. I knew that engaging with them online would only give them exactly what they wanted. It would give them a target for their manufactured outrage and a distraction from their very real problems. Refusing to comment or defend myself was the ultimate display of power, even if they did not realize it yet. I locked my phone and placed it face down on my desk, silencing the endless stream of notifications. The court of public opinion meant absolutely nothing when compared to the crushing weight of the federal legal system. They could have their likes, their comments, and their false sympathy. They could call me an ugly dropout and a bitter sister all they wanted. I was not going to fight a war using internet comments. I was preparing to take lethal corporate action. At 10:15 that morning, I called Elena Marquez, the general counsel of my wealth management firm. Elena had spent nearly 2 decades handling trust disputes, corporate fraud, and distressed acquisitions. She did not react when I explained the Christmas confrontation or Brittany's social media performance. She focused exclusively on the documents. Within an hour, our forensic team verified that the signature on the commercial consent letter had been digitally copied from an unrelated trust filing. The metadata showed that the document had been created on a computer registered to my father's logistics company. The private equity firm confirmed that Richard had submitted the application electronically and represented himself as an authorized controller of the trust. Elena assembled the evidence into a formal packet for the emergency hearing. She included the original trust agreement, the discretionary pause clause, 5 years of excessive distribution records, the forged consent letter, and the communications Richard had sent to the lender. The investigation also exposed how close his business was to collapse. Several of his creditors had been trying to sell their distressed loans for months. My acquisitions department had already reviewed the company because it appeared on an industry risk list. Once the fraud was confirmed, I authorized Elena and the acquisitions team to resume negotiations. By early afternoon, we had binding assignments from the largest creditors and control over the majority of Richard's outstanding corporate debt. I was not purchasing those liabilities for revenge. Leaving them scattered among desperate lenders would allow Richard to manipulate one creditor against another and continue concealing his losses. Consolidating the debt gave my firm the power to protect unpaid vendors, preserve legitimate company records, and prevent him from borrowing against assets he did not own. At 3:45, Elena sent me the final hearing file. "Do not argue with Gallagher's performance," she advised. "Let him finish. Then identify yourself and submit the documents." I closed Brittany's social media page and opened the secure court portal. Online, my family could control the story through tears and accusations. In court, they would have to answer evidence. The digital clock on my computer monitor shifted to exactly 4:00 in the afternoon. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my corner office, the winter sky over Chicago was already turning a deep, bruised purple. The city was actively preparing for a night of massive New Year's Eve celebrations. I clicked the secure meeting link provided by the Legal Courier earlier that morning. A small digital waiting room window popped up on my screen before smoothly transitioning into the live virtual courtroom. I ensured my microphone was muted and my webcam was completely disabled. My participant display name was set to simply read Harrison Family Trust Administrator. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and watched the video feeds populate the screen. There were three primary video boxes on the monitor. The first box displayed the Honorable Judge David Miller sitting behind a heavy wooden desk in his official chambers. He looked incredibly tired and slightly irritated to be dealing with an emergency injunction on the afternoon of New Year's Eve. The second box remained entirely black, displaying my anonymous title in stark white letters. The third box was a live feed broadcasting directly from the grand study inside my parents' stone mansion. The extreme contrast between the seriousness of a federal legal proceeding and the absolute absurdity of my family could not have been more striking. My parents and my sister were already fully dressed for the lavish country club gala they had zero means of actually paying for. They had crammed themselves into the frame to present a united front of wealthy indignation. Patricia sat in the center wearing a floor-length emerald sequined gown. She was draped in heavy diamond necklaces and matching chandelier earrings that sparkled aggressively under the bright study lighting. Her posture was rigid and deeply arrogant. Richard sat to her right wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo with a crisp white bow tie. His face was flushed with his usual aggressive confidence, completely masking the fact that he was a bankrupt man actively committing federal loan fraud. Brittany was squeezed onto the left side of the leather sofa, wearing an incredibly flashy silver cocktail dress that looked much more appropriate for a nightclub than a serious legal hearing. She was entirely ignoring the judge currently speaking on the screen. Instead, she was frantically typing on her smartphone with her freshly manicured nails. I knew without a shadow of a doubt she was live updating her social media followers about how they were currently suing the evil bank to get their stolen money back. They all looked so incredibly smug. They genuinely believed this was just a minor administrative hurdle they could easily bully their way through before heading off to drink expensive champagne on someone else's dime. Sitting directly in front of them at the massive oak desk was Vincent Gallagher. The local attorney was exactly as flashy and obnoxious as his television commercials suggested. He wore a loud pinstripe suit and a bulky gold watch that caught the glare of the camera lens every single time he moved his hands. He was organizing a thick stack of legal briefs with exaggerated movements, clearly putting on a theatrical show for his clients, who were paying him a small fortune he would never actually receive. He looked like a man who was absolutely certain he was about to secure an easy victory against a faceless corporate bureaucracy. Judge Miller cleared his throat and officially called the preliminary hearing to order. He stated for the record that we were gathered to address an emergency judicial injunction filed by Patricia and Richard against the managing entity of the Harrison Family Trust. He noted the plaintiffs' demand for the immediate unfreezing of all financial assets and the restoration of their monthly distribution lines. Before the judge could even finish his standard opening remarks, Vincent Gallagher unmuted his microphone and launched into a highly aggressive and deeply theatrical monologue. Your Honor, my clients are the victims of a catastrophic and malicious breach of fiduciary duty, Gallagher bellowed into his webcam. His voice was unnecessarily loud, echoing through the high-quality speakers on my desk. For reasons that remain entirely unexplained and completely unjustified, the corporate entity managing the Harrison Family Trust executed a sudden total freeze on my clients' assets without a single word of prior notification. They have unlawfully restricted access to funds that my clients rely on for their daily survival and business operations. This draconian action was taken maliciously right before a major holiday, causing my clients to suffer irreparable social, emotional, and financial harm. I watched my mother nod vigorously in agreement with the lawyer's dramatic performance. She adjusted her diamond necklace and adopted an expression of deep, manufactured distress. She wanted the judge to believe she was a helpless victim being persecuted by a cruel banking system. She even managed to produce a single fake tear, delicately wiping it away with a silk handkerchief. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation designed solely to manipulate the legal system into doing her bidding. We are demanding an immediate judicial order forcing this negligent bank to lift the discretionary pause. Gallagher continued, waving a piece of printed paper in the air for dramatic effect. My clients are upstanding members of this community. They have significant financial obligations and a major philanthropic event to attend this very evening. This faceless trust administrator is holding their lives hostage based on some automated glitch or gross administrative incompetence. If these funds are not released by the end of this hour, we are prepared to file a massive lawsuit against the managing institution for extreme emotional distress and corporate negligence. Gallagher leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with a deeply satisfied smirk. Patricia patted his shoulder approvingly. Richard puffed out his chest, looking like the undisputed king of the castle once again. Brittany finally looked up from her phone, offering the camera a haughty, triumphant glare. They felt completely invincible. They firmly believed the bank's legal department was cowering behind my black screen, terrified by the threat of bad publicity and a costly lawsuit. They thought their aggressive tactics had already won the day and secured their stolen wealth. Judge Miller listened patiently until Gallagher finally finished his long-winded performance. The judge pinched the bridge of his nose, removed his reading glasses, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He was clearly unimpressed by the theatrical display, but obligated to follow standard legal procedure. He leaned forward and addressed his camera directly, speaking to the black box that represented my presence on the call. He adjusted his microphone slightly before delivering his formal instruction to the digital courtroom. The court recognizes the plaintiff's arguments, Judge Miller said, in a dry, monotone voice. He shifted his gaze to his secondary monitor, where my blank video feed was currently positioned. We must now hear from the defense regarding the implementation of this discretionary pause. However, I note that the representative for the Harrison Family Trust has remained entirely anonymous up to this point in the proceeding. In order to move forward with an emergency injunction of this magnitude, the designated trustee must identify themselves for the official court record. We cannot conduct a binding legal hearing with a completely blank screen. The tension in my quiet office suddenly spiked. The moment I had been meticulously planning for 5 long years was finally here. I looked at the video feed of my family one last time. They were completely oblivious, smiling their cruel, arrogant smiles. They were so consumed by their own vanity and greed that they had absolutely no idea the ground beneath their feet was about to vanish completely. Their entire fraudulent reality was hanging by a single microscopic thread. I ask that the authorized representative for the Harrison Family Trust please unmute their microphone and turn on their camera, the judge requested firmly. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, filtered air fill my lungs. I reached out and rested my hand on my computer mouse. I adjusted the crisp lapels of my tailored designer blazer, making sure my posture was perfectly straight. I was not the scared 33-year-old scapegoat they had abandoned on Christmas morning. I was the absolute authority over their entire existence. I moved my cursor over the small video icon at the very bottom of the screen. Then I clicked. The small camera indicator turned green. I did not say a word at first. I simply let the high-definition camera capture my calm, unblinking expression. The absolute paralyzing shock that washed over the faces of my parents and my sister was cinematic. Brittany gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as she dropped her smartphone onto the leather sofa. Richard turned a sickening shade of white, his aggressive posture instantly collapsing as the blood drained entirely from his face. Patricia stared at the screen with wide, uncomprehending eyes, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. They were completely paralyzed. Vincent Gallagher, however, did not share their personal paralysis. He was a professional bulldog, and he immediately tried to salvage his crumbling case. "Your Honor, I object to this ambush," Gallagher shouted, leaning aggressively into his webcam. "This is a clear conflict of interest. The defense has maliciously concealed their identity to manipulate this hearing. I demand this individual be removed from the call and a neutral third party be appointed immediately." Judge Miller held up his hand, silencing the frantic attorney. "Mr. Gallagher, the court requested the trustee identify themselves," the judge said sternly. "They have complied. Do you have proof of your appointment, miss? I smoothly shared my screen displaying my ironclad legal identification alongside the official notarized trust documents signed by my late grandfather. I confirm for the official court record that I am Jillian Harrison, the sole and absolute executor of the Harrison Family Trust, I stated clearly. My grandfather legally bypassed Patricia and Richard Harrison, placing the estate entirely under my discretionary control. The pause on their distributions was executed within my full legal rights as trustee due to extreme financial negligence. Before Vincent Gallagher could formulate another loud objection, I accelerated the takedown. I was not just here to defend my actions. I was here to completely dismantle their fraudulent reality. Your Honor, I initiated the discretionary pause yesterday morning because I discovered a severe breach of fiduciary security. I continued keeping my voice perfectly level. I am submitting an urgent evidentiary file to the court secure portal right now. I hit send on my keyboard, transmitting the digital packet directly to Judge Miller's chambers. Included in that file is a commercial lending agreement from a private equity firm. Richard Harrison recently submitted this application in a desperate attempt to secure a high-interest bailout loan for his failing logistics company. I watched Richard physically flinch on the screen. He reached up and loosened his crisp white bow tie, suddenly struggling to breathe. In the collateral declaration section of this application, I explained to the judge Richard Harrison actively attempted to pledge the protected assets of the Harrison Family Trust as unauthorized collateral. He forged my signature and fabricated a letter of consent, falsely claiming he was the managing director of the estate. He committed federal wire fraud in a failed attempt to save his bankrupt business. The silence in the digital courtroom was absolute. Patricia slowly turned her head to look at her husband, the emerald sequins on her gown shimmering under the study lights. She had clearly known nothing about the loan or the forgery. Brittany looked completely terrified, her arrogant demeanor entirely erased. Vincent Gallagher stared at his client, realizing he had just walked blindly into a massive federal crime. Judge Miller adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at his secondary monitor, reviewing the digital file I had just submitted. The heavy silence stretched on for 2 full minutes. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, sipping my coffee, as the judge scrutinized the forged signatures and the desperate financial disclosures. When Judge Miller finally looked back up at the camera, his expression was completely devoid of any sympathy. "Mr. Gallagher," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Did you review these financial documents before you filed an emergency injunction in my court today?" Gallagher swallowed hard, his flashy confidence completely evaporated. "No, Your Honor." He stammered frantically, shuffling his papers. "My clients assured me this was a simple administrative banking error. They did not disclose any commercial loan applications or collateral pledges to my firm." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes fixed fiercely on my father. "Richard Harrison, you have brought a frivolous and fraudulent injunction before this court while actively concealing a federal crime," Judge Miller declared. "You attempted to use the judicial system to force the release of funds you had illegally pledged as collateral. I am dismissing the plaintiff's lawsuit entirely with prejudice. This court will not entertain any further motions regarding the Harrison Family Trust." Furthermore, the judge continued his tone, turning incredibly stern. "I am officially forwarding these forged commercial loan documents to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate review. I strongly suggest you retain criminal defense counsel Mr. Harrison because an investigation into federal wire fraud and attempted bank fraud is absolutely impending. This hearing is adjourned." Judge Miller logged off his video box, fading to black, but the secure meeting link remained active for the remaining participants. Vincent Gallagher immediately muted his microphone, furiously packing his briefcase to abandon his toxic clients. Patricia was openly weeping, her carefully constructed high society facade completely shattered. Richard sat frozen in his tuxedo, staring blankly at the webcam. He was a destroyed man. Before I disconnected from the call, I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the camera lens. I had one final piece of business to conduct. "As a professional courtesy, before we end this call, Richard, I have one more update regarding your commercial logistics company," I said, making sure my voice carried through the speakers in their grand study. Since you were so desperately seeking a corporate bailout, I took the liberty of looking into your outstanding debts. My wealth management firm has a very aggressive acquisitions department. I smiled a cold, sharp expression that offered absolutely no comfort. We recently purchased the entirety of your failing company's debt from your primary creditors. I own your corporate liabilities now. You are officially and irreversibly bankrupt. I did not wait for his response. I clicked the red button at the bottom of my screen and terminated the Zoom call. The monitor went dark, leaving my parents and my sister legally and financially ruined in the span of 20 minutes. I sat in the quiet elegance of my corner office listening to the soft hum of the city traffic below. They were completely exposed. Their fake wealth was gone, their business was liquidated, and the threat of federal prison was actively looming over my father's head. Yet a dark sense of amusement bubbled up in my chest. Despite being utterly bankrupt, they still had 150 wealthy guests arriving at the prestigious local country club in exactly 2 hours. They were hosting a lavish New Year's Eve gala they had absolutely no way of paying for. And as the new legal owner of my father's corporate debt, I had the immediate authority to collect on his outstanding assets. I casually moved my hand over my keyboard, navigated to my secure corporate acquisitions portal, and accessed the financial holds menu. I verified the transaction codes, took one final incredibly satisfying breath, and tapped the enter key to officially seize the country club payment escrow. The digital status instantly changed from a pending state to completely intercepted. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind now. Before leaving my office, I called Mr. Thomas, the general manager of Oak Brook Country Club. He had already received notice that the family's payment escrow had been intercepted, and he was preparing to suspend service before the guests arrived. I told him not to punish the employees, musicians, caterers, or vendors for my parents' fraud. My firm would temporarily guarantee the legitimate event expenses, while the disputed escrow remained under legal control. Every server would be paid. Every kitchen employee would receive the wages they had earned. The band and outside suppliers would not lose income, because Richard and Patricia had tried to host an event with money they no longer controlled. Mr. Thomas understood immediately. My company had managed portions of the country club's retirement and reserve accounts for several years, though my parents had never known it. "There is one more thing," I said. "My son and I will be attending." "You will have your usual table by the windows," he replied. "And I will make sure the staff treats both of you with the respect you deserve." After ending the call, I returned to my apartment and found Leo building a tower from wooden blocks in the living room. I knelt beside him and explained that we had been invited to a New Year's Eve celebration. I did not tell him about lawsuits, frozen accounts, or corporate debt. Those burdens belong to adults. "We do not have to go," I told him. "But I want you to see that what happened on Christmas was not your fault. You did nothing wrong." Leo considered my words with the serious expression he used whenever something mattered deeply. "Will Grandma be there?" he asked. "Yes. Can we leave if she is mean again immediately?" That answer seemed to satisfy him. He chose his miniature tuxedo and proudly attempted to fasten the buttons himself. I changed into my midnight blue gown, checked the corporate payment guarantee one final time, and placed the trust documents inside my silver clutch. When Leo was ready, I took his hand and led him toward the elevator. The drive from downtown Chicago to the prestigious Oak Brook Country Club took 45 minutes. The city was alive with the glittering energy of New Year's Eve. Snow fell gently from the dark sky, dusting the pavement in a pristine layer of white. I had stopped by my apartment to change into my formal attire and pick up Leo. I had spent an extra 10 minutes making sure my hair and makeup were absolutely flawless. I wanted my physical appearance to match the absolute power I now wielded over their lives. Leo was dressed in a sharp miniature tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome and delightfully oblivious to the financial carnage I had just unleashed upon our relatives. I wore a custom-designed midnight blue silk gown that draped perfectly against my frame. I paired it with elegant diamond drop earrings and a simple silver clutch. I did not look like the bitter, jealous outcast my sister had desperately tried to portray to the internet. I looked like a woman who owned the very ground they were standing on. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the country club. A valet hurried out to open my car door, tipping his hat respectfully as I stepped out into the crisp winter air. I unbuckled Leo, took his warm hand in mine, and walked up the wide stone steps. The heavy double doors swung open, welcoming us into a magnificent foyer bathed in the warm light of massive crystal chandeliers. I helped Leo take off his heavy winter coat and handed it to the attendant at the cloakroom. I smoothed out his tiny lapels, gave him a reassuring smile, and led him down the plush carpeted hallway toward the main ballroom. I could hear the upbeat tempo of a live jazz band playing in the distance, mingling with the loud, arrogant laughter of my parents' 150 high society guests. I pushed open the gilded ballroom doors and stepped inside, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high. The space was absolutely breathtaking, decorated with cascading silver ribbons, towering ice sculptures, and round tables draped in imported white linen. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated smoothly through the dense crowd, balancing heavy silver trays, loaded with gourmet hors d'oeuvres, caviar, and tall flutes of expensive vintage champagne. But as we walked further into the room, moving gracefully past a towering champagne pyramid near the entrance, the atmosphere began to shift. It started as a subtle ripple of awareness. A few guests standing near the doorway turned their heads, their casual smiles instantly freezing into expressions of deep, uncomfortable shock. The ripple quickly transformed into a tidal wave of hostile attention. The live jazz band continued to play their upbeat melody, but the conversations closest to us abruptly died out, replaced by a harsh, buzzing symphony of aggressive whispers. I saw my Aunt Susan standing near the elaborate seafood buffet, chatting animatedly with my cousin Danielle. The moment Susan spotted me, her eyes narrowed into tight, hateful slits. She leaned in and whispered viciously into Danielle's ear, and both women turned to glare at me with absolute unfiltered disgust. They were looking at me through the distorted lens of Brittany's tearful social media video. In their minds, I was the cruel sister who ruined Christmas and refused to help our struggling parents over a simple banking glitch. They firmly believed I was a socially unfit dropout who had maliciously crashed an elite gala just to cause a pathetic scene. They muttered terrible insults under their breath, deliberately speaking loud enough for me to hear them over the music. I did not shrink away from their hateful stares. I did not look down at the floor or quicken my pace to find a dark corner to hide in. I walked straight through the center of the ballroom, holding Leo's hand securely in mine. I maintained a serene, completely unbothered smile. I made direct, unflinching eye contact with every single extended family member who dared to point a finger at me. I watched them shift uncomfortably under my gaze, confused by my absolute lack of shame. They expected me to look ragged and deeply apologetic. Instead, I was radiating an aura of total, untouchable authority. I squeezed Leo's hand gently, making sure he felt entirely safe amidst the glaring faces of the people who were supposed to be our family. As I navigated toward a quiet table near the massive arched windows at the back of the room, a man in a sharp gray suit briskly cut through the crowd. It was Mr. Thomas, the general manager of the country club. Several of my parents' society friends watched him approach, whispering excitedly amongst themselves. They clearly anticipated that the manager was going to politely but firmly ask the unwanted family scapegoat to leave the premises immediately. Aunt Susan actually took a step forward, eager to watch me get publicly humiliated, and escorted out by the building security staff. She had a cruel, expectant smirk plastered across her heavily made-up face, fully prepared to watch me be dragged out into the freezing snow and thrown into the parking lot like a common trespasser. But Mr. Thomas did not signal for security. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, clasped his hands together in front of his waist, and offered me a deep, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, Miss Harrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed whispers of the nearby guests. "We are incredibly honored to have you join us tonight. I have already ensured that your preferred table by the window is reserved, and the kitchen has prepared a special dessert plate for the young gentleman. Is there anything else you require at this moment to make your evening more comfortable? A collective gasp rippled through the immediate circle of onlookers. Aunt Susan looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Cousin Danielle actually dropped her cocktail napkin onto the floor in pure shock. They were entirely baffled. The manager of the most exclusive country club in the county was treating the family embarrassment like visiting royalty. They had absolutely no idea that less than an hour ago, I had legally seized the escrow account that was supposed to pay for this entire extravagant affair and then personally guaranteed the venue's payment out of my own corporate funds so the staff would not walk out. They did not know that I was the only reason the lights were still on, the kitchen was still serving food, and the jazz band was still playing. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas," I replied, my voice smooth and gracious. "Everything is perfectly fine for now. Please ensure the waitstaff keeps the champagne flowing for the guests. It is going to be a very memorable evening for everyone here." Mr. Thomas nodded respectfully and stepped aside, gesturing for a waiter to escort Leo and me to our reserved table. I sat Leo down in a plush velvet chair and handed him a small plate of chocolate-dipped strawberries that the waiter immediately provided. I took a seat beside him, crossing my legs and resting my hands elegantly on the table. From my vantage point at the back of the room, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I scanned the crowd, locating my immediate family. Richard was standing near the grand bar, sweating profusely inside his custom tuxedo. He was gripping a glass of scotch tightly, desperately trying to maintain normal conversation with his business associates, while knowing federal investigators were likely already building a criminal case against him. Brittany was holding court near the center of the dance floor, showing off her flashy silver cocktail dress and loudly accepting sympathetic compliments from her gullible friends. She was performing the role of the resilient daughter, with absolute perfection, completely blind to the fact that her entire world had just been legally dismantled in a virtual courtroom. She had no idea her trust fund was permanently gone, or that her husband Kevin was likely receiving frantic phone calls from creditors at this very moment. I watched her throw her head back in a loud laugh, consumed by her own vanity. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, celebrating a false reality built entirely on stolen money and carefully curated lies. The jazz band transitioned into a slow, elegant number, and the dance floor began to fill with couples swaying to the music. And then I saw Patricia. My mother was standing near the grand staircase, her emerald sequined gown shimmering as she aggressively directed the catering staff. She turned around to survey the room, and that is when her eyes finally locked onto mine across the sea of wealthy guests. The champagne flute in her hand halted halfway to her mouth. I could see the veins pulsing in her neck. The sheer, unhinged rage that instantly contorted her carefully powdered face was absolutely terrifying. She was completely losing whatever shred of sanity she had left. She completely abandoned her conversation, shoved past a group of startled country club members, and began her furious, deliberate march straight across the ballroom floor, directly toward my table. The heavy bass of the jazz band seemed to fade into the background as my mother closed the final few yards between us. Her emerald sequined gown swished angrily around her ankles. She abruptly stopped inches from my table, her chest heaving as she glared down at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. For a moment, the sheer intensity of her rage was so palpable it felt like it sucked all the oxygen out of the immediate area. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the white linen tablecloth, causing Leo's small plate of strawberries to rattle. "What exactly do you think you are doing here?" she hissed, her voice trembling with an ugly, suppressed fury. "You were explicitly banned from this event. You are a spiteful, vindictive little monster, and I want you out of my sight right this instant." I did not flinch at all. I slowly picked up a linen napkin and gently wiped a smudge of chocolate from Leo's chin, completely ignoring my mother's aggressive posturing. "I am simply enjoying a lovely New Year's Eve gala, Mom," I replied softly, keeping my eyes focused entirely on my son. "It is a beautiful venue. It would be a shame to see it shut down over unpaid vendor invoices." Patricia let out a loud, sharp gasp. She opened her mouth to unleash a torrent of insults, but a sudden commotion near the center of the ballroom cut her off completely. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing mid-measure. The silence that fell over the massive room was deafening. Every head turned toward the dance floor where my brother-in-law Kevin was staring at his cell phone with absolute horror. His arrogant face had suddenly gone completely, horrifyingly gray. "Are you out of your mind, Brittany?" Kevin bellowed. His voice cracked like a whip, echoing against the high vaulted ceiling. Everyone stared in shock as he aggressively shoved his smartphone right into my sister's face. Brittany stumbled backward, her silver cocktail dress catching the light as she tried to bat his hand away. Kevin absolutely did not lower his voice. "I just got an emergency alert from our home security cameras," he shouted. "There are 2 tow trucks actively backing into our driveway right now. They are repossessing both of our vehicles. They sent a digital notice saying the lease payments were permanently revoked by the primary account holder." Brittany frantically grabbed his arm, looking around at the staring crowd with wide, panicked eyes. "Kevin, stop it!" she whispered fiercely. "People are actively watching us. We can handle this privately." "There is no handling this privately!" Kevin screamed, ripping his arm out of her grasp. "I just logged into the joint banking portal to manually push the payment through, and your entire trust fund sub-account is gone. It does not say frozen, Brittany. It says permanently closed. The balance is 0. You told me this was just a minor banking error. You lied to me. We have absolutely nothing left." The brutal public humiliation was truly instantaneous and absolute. Brittany covered her face with her hands, finally realizing that the social media lies she had spun all day could not save her from this brutal reality. She burst into genuine frantic tears, humiliated in front of the exact high society friends she had spent her entire life trying to impress. At the grand bar across the room, the final piece of their fraudulent empire shattered. My father Richard had been watching his son-in-law explode with growing terror. He slowly pulled his own cell phone from his tuxedo pocket. He was reading the formal corporate notification from my acquisitions firm, confirming that we now legally owned the entirety of his logistics company's massive debt. He let out a low, agonizing groan. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed heavily into a velvet bar stool, his expensive Scotch glass slipping from his fingers and shattering loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He put his head between his knees, utterly defeated by his own criminal arrogance. Patricia watched her perfect world disintegrate in a matter of seconds. The realization finally hit her. She turned her head slowly back toward my table. She looked at my calm expression, and then she looked down at the expensive diamond necklace resting against her own chest, realizing it was purchased with money she no longer had any access to. Her mind snapped under the weight of her absolute loss. She let out a guttural, feral scream and lunged across the table. She raised her hand high into the air, aiming a vicious, open-handed slap directly at my face. I did not even blink. I shot my hand up and caught her wrist mid-air. My grip was like a steel vise. The loud smack of my hand catching her arm echoed sharply in the silent ballroom. Patricia froze, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes as I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not let go of her wrist. I stepped closer to her, forcing her to look up at me. "You do not get to hit me anymore," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You do not get to treat me like garbage ever again." I shoved her arm away from me in absolute disgust. I turned away from her and faced the silent, staring crowd of extended family members, elite country club guests, and judgmental relatives. Aunt Susan and Cousin Danielle were frozen in place, their cruel smirks entirely wiped from their faces. I took a very slow, deep breath, letting my voice carry across the massive ballroom with crystal-clear authority. "For over a decade, this family has treated me like a useless burden," I declared loudly. "You have mocked my career, belittled my life choices, and called me a failure. You all eagerly believed the pathetic lies my sister posted on the internet today. The absolute truth is that my parents are completely bankrupt. The truth is that my father actively committed federal wire fraud by attempting to illegally use the Harrison Family Trust to secure a massive commercial bailout loan for his failing business. And the truth is that I am the sole active trustee of that exact estate. I am the one who froze their accounts because I caught them stealing. A loud collective gasp ripped through the room. I looked directly at Aunt Susan, who actually took a step backward under my intense gaze. Just yesterday, I watched my mother hand out 12 luxury gifts to Brittany's children, while explicitly telling my son he was getting absolutely nothing, because money was supposedly tight. I continued, my voice steady and powerful. They thought they could humiliate my child, and I would just quietly accept it like I always did. They were incredibly wrong. I have legally stripped them of every single cent. Their cars are gone. Their mansion is a liability. Their business is completely liquidated. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was now weeping openly into her hands, completely stripped of her dignity. You explicitly wanted me out of this family, I said. Consider it done. Enjoy the expensive champagne, everyone. I paid for it all out of pure pity. I calmly grabbed my small silver clutch, turned my back on them forever, and walked away with my son Leo into the cold winter night. Through the heavy glass doors, I saw country club security moving quickly toward the ballroom. Patricia's attempt to strike me, Kevin's public outburst, and the growing confrontation had prompted Mr. Thomas to call the local police. The officers who arrived that night were there to restore order, separate the people involved, and take statements about the attempted assault. They were not there to arrest my father for a federal financial crime that had only just been referred for investigation. One officer spoke privately with me near the entrance, while another reviewed footage from the ballroom security cameras. I declined to pursue an immediate assault charge against Patricia, but I requested that the incident be formally documented. Mr. Thomas informed my parents that their membership privileges were suspended and ordered them to leave the property. Richard walked out under the eyes of the same guests he had spent years trying to impress. He was not wearing handcuffs, but the confidence had vanished from his face. He understood that the documents submitted in court would soon reach people he could not intimidate with money or social status. 3 days later, federal investigators served subpoenas on his logistics company, the private equity lender, and the institutions that had processed his electronic application. Agents seized company computers and obtained the original transmission records connecting Richard to the forged authorization. A week after the gala, accompanied by a criminal defense attorney, my father surrendered at the federal courthouse. There were no dramatic police cruisers or public struggle. There was only a quiet photograph of him entering the building with his head lowered, finally confronting consequences that could not be blamed on me. By then, Leo and I had already returned to our normal routine. I drove him to school, read with him before bed, and refused to let my family's collapse become the center of his childhood. 3 months passed in a steady, highly efficient blur of corporate maneuvering and strict legal proceedings. Spring was finally beginning to thaw the frozen streets of Chicago, and the heavy, toxic winter of my family's delusions had officially melted away. The fallout from that explosive New Year's Eve gala was swift, brutal, and entirely public. My wealth management firm moved with lethal precision to handle the massive debt we had legally purchased. Richard's logistics company was entirely liquidated. Our corporate acquisitions team systematically stripped his failing business down to its bare studs. We quickly auctioned off the remaining commercial freight trucks, sold the warehouse leases to the highest bidder, and redirected the remaining capital to pay off the furious vendors he had originally defrauded. Richard was left with absolutely nothing to his name except towering legal bills and a permanently destroyed professional reputation in the business community. The federal wire fraud charges carried a severe penalty, but his high-priced defense attorney managed to negotiate a highly restrictive plea deal to keep him out of a federal penitentiary. To avoid serving actual jail time for his desperate loan forgery, Richard and Patricia were forced to immediately surrender all their remaining personal assets. The sprawling stone mansion in the affluent suburbs was put on the market and sold well below the original asking price just to satisfy their outstanding angry creditors. Every piece of custom furniture, every imported rug, and every single expensive painting they had ever purchased was abruptly seized and auctioned off to cover the massive legal restitution fees they now owed. The luxury vehicles, the designer jewelry, and the prestigious country club memberships were all permanently revoked. My parents were abruptly thrust into a harsh reality they had spent their entire lives mocking and avoiding. They were forced to downsize to a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. There were no vaulted ceilings, no crystal chandeliers, and certainly no catering staff to clean up their daily messes. Instead, they had to deal with loud neighbors, peeling linoleum floors, and the constant deafening roar of commercial freight trains passing by their tiny living room window every single night. I heard from a distant cousin that Patricia spent her first week in the new apartment, sobbing uncontrollably on a cheap fabric sofa, completely unable to process her new lower-middle-class existence. She could no longer host lavish dinner parties or brag to her wealthy socialite friends, because those friends had immediately blocked her phone number the morning after the country club disaster. The social exile was absolute and unrelenting. They were now living off a meager fixed income, forced to clip grocery coupons and strictly budget their utilities, experiencing the exact financial struggle they had always falsely accused me of having. My sister Brittany faced an equally devastating reality check. The moment her husband Kevin realized the trust fund was permanently gone, and the luxury lease payments were actively bouncing, the illusion of their perfect marriage shattered completely. Kevin was a shallow man who valued high society status above all else, and he was absolutely furious that Brittany had lied to him about the severity of the banking freeze. He filed for a contentious divorce less than 2 weeks after the New Year's Eve gala. He cited irreconcilable financial differences and moved out of their leased home, leaving Brittany to deal with the overwhelming collection notices entirely on her own. Without my parents' funds to float her lavish lifestyle and without a wealthy husband to pay the daily bills, the golden child was abruptly forced to enter the unforgiving real world. For the first time in her 30 years of life, Brittany had to actively search for steady employment. With a college degree she had never used and zero actual work experience on her resume, her professional options were incredibly limited. She eventually secured a minimum-wage retail job, working the floor at a mid-tier clothing boutique in a busy suburban shopping mall. The poetic justice of her new situation was almost difficult to comprehend. The arrogant woman who had sneered at my successful career and called me a low-level clerk was now spending her days folding discounted sweaters and organizing clearance racks for highly demanding customers. According to the same distant cousin, Brittany constantly complained to anyone who would listen. She whined endlessly to her retail co-workers and store patrons about how unfair her life was. She spun wild, delusional stories about how a massive fortune was unjustly stolen from her by a jealous, toxic sibling. But without the designer clothes and the expensive car to back up her arrogant attitude, nobody paid attention to her complaints. She was just another disgruntled retail worker, unhappy with her shift schedule, completely invisible to the wealthy people she used to call her peers. Her desperate, endless cries for unearned sympathy simply faded into the mundane background noise of the busy shopping mall, forever leaving her totally isolated in her own bitter resentment. While my parents and Brittany struggled with the consequences of their choices, I focused on building something healthier for Leo. I moved us into a comfortable home closer to his school with a small backyard where he could play without worrying about disturbing anyone. He chose a bright bedroom overlooking an old maple tree and covered one wall with drawings, photographs, and certificates from school. I also restructured the Harrison Family Trust. The estate would no longer fund luxury allowances, country club memberships, or businesses built on fabricated success. After all legitimate creditors and employees were paid, a portion of the recovered assets was placed into an education fund for Leo and any future children in the family who demonstrated responsibility. Another portion created a charitable program in my grandfather's name, supporting financial literacy courses and emergency housing for single parents. That decision felt more meaningful than watching another designer car disappear. My grandfather had built his fortune through discipline and work, Transforming part of it into opportunities for people who genuinely needed help was the first time the trust had reflected his actual values, rather than my parents' vanity. Leo gradually stopped asking why his cousins had received so many Christmas gifts while he received nothing. He became more interested in our Saturday breakfast, library visits, and movie nights with Martha. The memory did not disappear, but it lost its power over him. One evening, while we were hanging new photographs in our living room, Leo looked at me and asked whether we still had a family. I set the frame down and pulled him into my arms. "We have the people who love us," I said. "That is what family is." For the first time in my life, the answer felt completely true. Looking back on that chaotic New Year's Eve, the most valuable lesson I learned was not about money or corporate revenge. It was about the absolute power of walking away. For 33 years, I allowed my parents and my sister to dictate my worth. I stayed quiet to keep the peace, believing that if I just endured their cruelty a little longer, they would eventually see my value. But toxic people do not change just because you suffer in silence. They only change their behavior when you finally strip away their power. My family thought that leaving my son with 0 gifts would put me in my place. They did not realize they were just handing me the scissors to finally cut the strings. True family is not defined by bloodlines, shared last names, or performing for people who constantly tear you down. Family is about who actually shows up for you. It is about the people who celebrate your victories, respect your boundaries, and protect your peace. It took dismantling an entire fraudulent empire for me to understand that I was never the problem. I was simply the scapegoat they used to hide their own massive insecurities. If you are trapped in a cycle of family abuse, please know that you do not owe your loyalty to people who treat you like a burden. Your worth is not determined by their ability to appreciate it. You have the absolute right to pack up your life and build a new one where you are celebrated instead of tolerated. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your true worth and rebuild your life? How did you finally find the courage to set those hard boundaries? I would love to hear your stories and experiences in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, finding your voice, and taking back your power. Remember that you are always stronger than the people who try to break you.